Great Sphinx of Giza, half lion, half man, has crouched on the edge of the desert for thousands of years, guarding the pyramids behind it. The statue is over 4,500 years old, with most scholars dating it to around 2,500 BCE during Egypt's 4th dynasty, likely under Pharaoh Khafre. But whispers suggest a darker mystery. Some say the Sphinx could be far older, a relic of a lost civilization. Its body shows scars that look like water erosion, not desert winds. Could it really predate the desert itself? Or are we misreading the language of stone? The Sphinx stretches about 73 meters in length and rises roughly 20 meters high, taller than a 5-story building. Its body, extended like a lion at rest, suggests strength and vigilance. Its human face, though softened by time, still carries the faint geometry of a royal portrait, calm, distant, and commanding. The statue stares due east, directly toward the rising sun, as if locked in an eternal conversation with the dawn. Unlike the pyramids assembled from millions of limestone blocks, the Sphinx was cut directly from the Giza Plateau. The head and neck are sculpted from a harder band of limestone geologists call Member 3, while most of the torso lies in softer alternating layers known as Member 2. This simple difference helps explain why the face holds sharper detail, while the body has weathered into rounded, undulating contours. But it also opens the door to questions that refuse to go away. If different layers decay at different rates, how securely can erosion stand in for a clock? The Sphinx is not freestanding. It sits inside a deep rectangular trench, an enclosure quarried around it to release the body from the bedrock. Those quarried blocks were not discarded. They became the core stones of the Sphinx temple and the nearby Valley Temple associated with Khafre. Geological mapping has traced continuous layers from the enclosure walls into the massive blocks of these temples. In other words, the very rock cut away to shape the Sphinx was restacked to build the shrines at its feet. This connection ties the statue into a coordinated construction program on the plateau in the Old Kingdom. It wasn't an isolated sculpture left to the sands, it was part of a larger design. And yet the enclosure walls tell a different kind of story. Their surfaces are etched with vertical, rounded channels and scalloped profiles that don't look like the horizontal scouring of wind-blown sand. They look, to some eyes, like the signatures of running water. The mainstream account, though, seems clear. Around 2520 BC, Pharaoh Khafre undertook a grand building project. His pyramid rose behind the Sphinx, slightly smaller than his father Khufu's Great Pyramid, but still monumental. A processional causeway ran from the pyramid down to the valley toward the Nile. The Sphinx crouched along this axis, aligned with the east-west ritual path of the sun, a guardian of horizon and kingship. More than a millennium later, Pharaoh Thutmose IV placed a granite stela between the paws, the so-called dream stela, recounting how he cleared the Sphinx of sand and restored it. Whatever its exact origin, the Sphinx had become sacred, a fixture of Egypt's religious landscape. But even within this solid frame, a different reading of the rock keeps surfacing. In the early 1990s, the geologist Robert Schoch examined the enclosure walls and the Sphinx's body and argued that the rounded channels and vertical grooves are best explained by heavy rainfall over long periods. Weather more consistent with the early Holocene thousands of years before the Old Kingdom. He pointed to seismic surveys indicating deeper weathering near the front of the Sphinx than the rear, suggesting extended exposure. With the writer John Anthony West, he proposed a startling possibility. The Sphinx might be far older than Khafre, perhaps carved when North Africa was greener, an idea that would push the statue back millennia. If that is true, then the Sphinx stood before the pyramids rose, watching a landscape of grasslands and seasonal rivers rather than dunes and dust. It would mean that somewhere in deep prehistory, a culture with the organization and engineering skill to carve a monument of this scale existed on the Giza Plateau. The implications are enormous, but extraordinary claims demand more than eloquent erosional curves. Other geologists responded. Kailal Gari and colleagues emphasized that arid climate processes, especially haloclasty, the growth of salt crystals inside porous limestone, can round and scallop surfaces in ways that mimic water's touch. Dew and capillary action can draw moisture into the stone. Crystals expand and contract with temperature extremes, prying grains apart. Add natural joints and bedding planes that guide decay, and the rock can break down in channels and bulges that look, at first glance, like the paths of running rain. In this view, the Sphinx's soft torso layers were always destined to suffer more than the harder head, without invoking a forgotten age of floods.
If we assume.
A third voice, the geologist Colin Reeder, proposed a middle course. He agreed the forms look waterworked, but suggested the culprit is not millennia of rainfall, rather episodic runoff channeled into the sunken enclosure during rare but intense desert storms. In Reeder's model, the Sphinx might predate Khafre slightly, perhaps begun in the time of Khufu, but still belong to the Old Kingdom. That possibility preserves the geological observations without leaping to prehistory. So the question tightens: if not rain, then what carved those curves, and when? Identity complicates the picture further. No inscription from the Old Kingdom names the builder. The head wears the Nemes headdress of a king and likely bore a uraeus, the rearing cobra, above the brow. Many Egyptologists attribute the face to Khafre by context, but the proportions raise eyebrows. The head is small relative to the massive body. One explanation is geological. The sculptors were constrained by a hard, brittle cap of member 3 limestone and natural fissures, limiting how large they could shape the head without catastrophic cracking. Another interpretation suggests the head was recarved from an earlier, larger form, perhaps a lion, into a royal portrait during the Old Kingdom. If that recarving happened, then some of what we read as age in the body could indeed reflect time before a king's face ever looked east over the Nile Valley. Was the Sphinx always a pharaoh, or did the royal visage arrive later, grafted onto a far older symbol of power? Around these puzzles swirl claims that sound dramatic but require caution. Writers like Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock have linked the Sphinx to the constellation Leo, arguing that its lion body mirrors the sky at a date around 10,500 BC. The idea is evocative: a stone lion greeting the dawn as the celestial lion rises. But mainstream scholarship notes problems. The Greek zodiac we call Leo appears in Egypt much later. The proposed alignments depend on choices critics call selective. The theory remains popular in books and on television, but is not widely accepted among archaeologists or Egyptologists. Then there is the Hall of Records, a legendary library said to lie beneath the Sphinx's paw, drawn from the prophecies of Edgar Cayce in the 20th century. Geophysical surveys have identified cavities and passages in and around the monument. Ancient tunnels and modern exploration shafts exist, but nothing like a hidden archive has been found. And while we are untangling myths, one more deserves retirement. Napoleon's soldiers did not shoot off the Sphinx's nose. Travelers' drawings from before his campaign already show the face damaged. Even when legends fall away, the stubborn core remains, stone that looks ancient, nested inside a complex that feels younger. So what can be said with confidence? The Sphinx was carved in place from the Mokattam Formation's limestone, and its enclosure walls provided the blocks used in the temples at its feet. That quarry-to-temple link strongly supports an Old Kingdom construction sequence. The stark difference between the head and body can be largely explained by geology: harder member 3 above, softer member 2 below, with joints and porosity inviting salt-driven decay. Radiocarbon dating of mortars from the surrounding pyramids and temples clusters, where historians expect 4th Dynasty works, dates that don't directly time the Sphinx's carving but do anchor the broader building era in which it sits. And yet, this synthesis still leaves space for debate. Schock's rainfall hypothesis, while a minority view, continues to attract attention, if only because those rounded vertical channels are visually persuasive. Reeder's runoff model keeps alive the idea that the statue could predate Khafre himself without leaping back to the Ice Age. Without a builder's inscription, and with the face's proportions raising the spectre of recarving, the door is not locked, only weighted shut by context. What if the prevailing story is accurate but incomplete? True in its broad strokes, yet missing a chapter. Picture the Giza Plateau in the early Old Kingdom. An imposing bedrock outcrop sits above the floodplain. Work gangs mark out a lion-bodied shape and begin to cut. The pit deepens. Blocks slide out on ramps to be stacked into the skeletal cores of temples. The head, constrained by the hard layer's fractures, stays small. Decades later, a new king reshapes the face, restores the enclosure, and folds the colossal guardian into his causeway and rituals. In this telling, the Sphinx is still an Old Kingdom masterpiece, but not necessarily a one pharaoh project. An evolving monument, adopted and adapted. Or imagine a bolder scenario. Long before Khafre, in a greener climate, a community with surprising organization carves a lion from the bedrock as a cosmic talisman, part solar marker, part royal emblem. Before kingship had the form we recognize, centuries pass, sands rise and fall. Old Kingdom builders find the eroded lion, quarry the enclosure to raise their temples, and chisel a king's face onto the ancient body. It is an elegant bridge between geology and archaeology. But without tools or settlements to match, it remains a story told in hypotheticals. The broader context encourages humility. Discoveries like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, megalithic enclosures raised more than 11,000 years ago, have shown that organized, large-scale stoneworking existed among people once thought to be only nomadic hunter-gatherers. That does not prove a prehistoric sphinx, but it warns us against assuming capacity tracks neatly with timelines we draw from later civilizations. Human ingenuity has a habit of appearing earlier and in more places than we expect. If the Sphinx does conceal an older core, what else might be hiding in the archaeological record, misread, unrecognized, or erased by time? There is, however, a human dimension that cannot be ignored. For modern Egyptians, the Sphinx is more than a puzzle in limestone. It is a national emblem, a testament to their ancestors' mastery. To suggest it was carved by an unknown culture risks, for many, diminishing that legacy. The debate is not only scientific, it touches identity and pride. It is understandable that proposals for radically older dates are received skeptically, and that extraordinary claims are asked to meet an extraordinary standard of proof. In this light, insisting on inscriptions, tools, workshops, or settlement traces near the Sphinx is not stubbornness, it is the discipline of history. So the impasse persists. On one side, a tightly integrated complex, quarry linked to a temple, aligned along a royal causeway framed by Old Kingdom mortars and masonry. On the other hand, rock faces that, under certain eyes and instruments, appear to carry the memory of heavier rains and deeper time, with a face whose proportions invite speculation about recarving. Between them lies a narrow middle path that accepts water's role but keeps the dates close, early in the 4th dynasty, rather than thousands of years before. Which narrative holds when the desert wind dies and only the stone is left to speak? At dawn, when the first light breaks along the horizon, the Sphinx's gaze catches a band of gold marching across the valley where the Nile once flooded. Pilgrims and tourists gather on the viewing terraces as shadows soften old scars. In that hour, the monument's silence feels deliberate, as if it has learned across ages how to keep a secret. Was it Khafre's grand project from the start, cut and consecrated within a single reign? Was it a lion recast into a king, its body already ancient when the face was new? Or is it, as some insist, the last witness of an age we have yet to recognize in the sand? The truth may be less dramatic than legend, yet no less profound. A masterpiece of the Old Kingdom, born from the plateau itself, restored and reimagined by generations who saw in it both the power of the sun and the permanence of stone. If someday a tool cache is found within the enclosure, or an inscription emerges in a buried block naming the patron, the debate could turn on a single line of hieroglyphs. Until then, every groove and channel will be read and reread as scholars test new models, run new scans, and argue about what water and salt can and cannot do. Perhaps the greater revelation lies not in proving a date, but in recognizing how much the Sphinx has already taught us. That monuments are not only built in an instant of history, but live through it, adopted, restored, and reinterpreted century after century. The Sphinx will not answer. The rock holds its counsel, and the desert keeps its vigil. But each season adds a fraction to our understanding, a survey line here, a weathering study there, a re-examination of old drawings that corrects a myth about noses and cannons. In the end, history is built much like the temples at the Sphinx's feet, layer by layer, with patience and care. So we return to the beginning. The Sphinx of Giza, lion-bodied, human-faced, carved from the bones of the plateau. Egypt's oldest colossal statue, unless of course it is older still. Is it the crowning statement of a pharaoh's vision or the survivor of a story we have not yet learned to read? For now, it crouches where it has always crouched, keeping watch over the pyramids and over us, guarding not only a necropolis but a question.